Before we find out specifically what it is that Margaret does for a living, and we will get to that, I want to chat about something that you have written about and focused on and talked about and photographed, and it's an old power drill. And one of the themes about what's next is, for the last 2 days, has been looking back as well. What's this power drill about, and why your obsession?
So it's a drill that I found when my parents were downsizing their house, and I have 8 older brothers and sisters, and so everyone was at the house. We were sorting through things, and people were taking china and quilts and photographs. And I saw this drill, and my father said, "That's your grandfather's drill. That's what he used to repair elevators for decades."
Big or this big?
It's pretty big and heavy. And I was like, I want that drill. And I think it was for a few reasons. One was that it's just a family heirloom, not necessarily the traditional thing that you think of as an heirloom, but it was meaningful to me that this was a tool that my grandfather used for decades to, provide for his family. Also to keep all the people using elevators throughout New York safe, not thinking about, all the work that goes into making these mechanical systems work every day. And just more broadly, that tools are really important in our lives. They're things that give us superhuman abilities. Have you guys ever used a drill, or like a cordless drill in particular? It is super satisfying. Makes you feel like a superhero.
It's so much easier than putting the screw in with your hand.
Oh, yes, that's right. And so, the idea that, designing and the design and the engineering that goes into either physical tools like my grandfather's drill or software tools, which is, what I and, a lot of folks in the high-tech industry ultimately are designing.
Well, what do you do for a living?
So I lead the design team on the business side of Facebook. And, for about the past 4.5 years have really been focused on how can we elevate the quality of design that businesses are using to create a presence on Facebook and also to kind of leverage the capabilities of the platform. And, making sure that those products are as easy to use and as effective to use as the consumer products that we've built, which is not necessarily something that Facebook historically had a lot of core competence in, because designing for businesses is different than designing for things that people use in their personal life.
So you are a tool designer.
I am a tool designer.
That's why the fascination.
There you go.
Tool. But this interest that you have in tools facing business as opposed to the tools that consumers use, why? What's the challenge there?
Yeah. Well, I think the bar historically has been pretty low for the quality of software tools that we use at work. I think that's for a number of reasons. Often people don't choose the tools that they get to use at work. Somebody else chooses it on their behalf. And also, in particular for highly specialized software, not a lot of people see it, so there's not that feedback loop that you get.
What are some examples of the kinds of things?
Well, so in our case, we develop a product that is really used by full-time people working in ad agencies. And so, in aggregate, it's not, millions and millions of people, but the use of that product actually impacts the lives of a lot of folks. I'll give you a more pointed example. My friend David Cronin heads up a lot of the software design at GE, and he was telling me once that his team had worked on redesigning the software that's used to maintain and manage nuclear power plants. And I was like, I hope you put your A-team on that. That is like a really stressful design engagement. Because, you probably got hundreds of people seeing that software.
But you can see how the designers would say this does not need to look pretty.
Well, it's not necessarily about looking pretty. It's about being effective and making work more efficient and more pleasurable, if possible. In certain contexts, efficiency is delightful, right? If somebody has to repeat something 75 times a day, and you can shave a little bit of the time off of that, that is delightful. But there's also, a sense that if we're spending so much time in software, and increasingly we all are in our day-to-day jobs, why can't it be beautiful? Isn't that also a sign of respect that we show to people in companies?
My wife, who's a physician, complains bitterly about the software that she has to use to enter medical records, which is incredibly clunky. Yep. By the way, not unified across offices and platforms and companies, and very ugly, and a learning curve each time, and has the sense that nobody's thinking in terms of let's make this work well for the doctors who are actually using it because they're just the doctors who are
Totally.
actually using it.
And this is something, my hope is that as we elevate the conversation about this, not only will it benefit business software in high tech and advertising, but that it will start to create a lot of excitement for designers to invest time in healthcare, in government, in education. A lot of these industries that have been pretty heavily underserved by internet and connected technologies and design specifically.
So you studied all of this in college for this?
No, not at all. I was a theater major undergrad, which I think my parents were quite concerned about, but to their credit, never actually said anything at the time. I think they probably knew that I was spunky enough to figure out what some way of providing for myself. But honestly, my theater training has been enormously valuable to me in my professional life. And when you think about it, as a designer, our jobs, the job primarily is to understand what all of you need in your life and to kind of work with engineering to kind of make that come to life. And so as a performer, the process of learning how to inhabit the life of somebody else and all of those empathy building experiences that you go through is actually remarkably applicable. To say nothing of the fact that producing live theater is one of the most intensely collaborative things you can do, and every performance is different. And this is just like software.
Why?
We push new versions of Facebook every single day, and every day we're looking at how people are using it, reinventing that experience in small ways, sometimes big ways. And so, that is, comes from intense collaboration between design, user research, engineering, product marketing. And so, to have an experience when you're young where you have to learn to not just rely on your own skills and ingenuity, but to really rely on other people's as well.
Can you talk a little bit about what it is we actually mean by the term design? We're at an event, we've been talking about technology, and of course, every piece of technology needs to be designed, but you're talking about something else. What do you mean by design?
Well, when I say design, and I say this as somebody who also went to art school for a period, and I think of myself in certain contexts as an artist, but I think about it as it's two pretty distinct kind of modes of working, although sometimes people play in the middle, which is interesting too. And I think of design as your creativity in service of other people, and that art is in service of the voice of the artist, and that actually both of those things are incredibly important to society. But in design, it really is about how can I internalize the needs of other people and figure out how to put materials or technology or whatever medium that I'm working in to their benefit, to help make their work or their life more easy, more pleasurable, more efficient, whatever the goal might be.
So does that mean that you have to be constantly checking in with the users?
Absolutely. I mean, one of the core things that we have to do, in particular for a company like Facebook, where we are designing basically for the whole human race, which is challenging, right? At least the percentage of them that are online, which is actually fairly small. There's many billions of people who still do not have access to the internet. But really to, constantly be doing the type of research that allows us to interact with people who are not in the bubble of Silicon Valley, who are not living on the coasts, who are living in high growth markets that are experiencing incredible change in the way that they work and live, so that we make sure that
Do you mean India, Africa, Asia?
Absolutely. To make sure that we are designing for people where they are and not where we are.
So what's a challenge that would fall into that category?
Well, the types of devices that most people use worldwide. I mean, over half of the world are not on, iPhone 6 Plus. They are on extremely basic, limited phones. And even as the penetration of smartphones increases, the connection speeds that people have access to are very low worldwide, and that's going to take years to change.
But Margaret, if you are living in Silicon Valley with a smartphone, how do you know what their reality is like?
So it's interesting, on Facebook, at the headquarters, on Tuesdays you can opt into 2G Tuesdays, where your phone will be reduced to a 2G connection so that you can, at least one day of the week, crawl through the experience of what it means to be,
How's your mood on those days?
It's people are cranky, I'm not gonna lie. You're just like waiting. And it's just a really great reminder that, with all of the exciting aspects of, the impact that video is having on the world and, the way that video experience is, growing so fast, that there's a large part of the world that can't access it in that way. So we have to create different ways to meet them, where they are right now and, until they can kind of catch up, both from a connection speed and device point of view.
What are the really, you've seen again and again, the obvious pitfalls that are made in the process of design?
Well, I think that there's a few. One is, at least in software design, in the context that I'm working in, falling in love with an idea too early. The creative process is one of iteration and a lot of divergent thinking, and the earlier you cling to the thing that you think is right, the less likely you are to
have you done that?
pick up. Absolutely, everyone has, right? Where you for some reason just grip onto something and you grip it close to you, and then you blind yourself to other ideas. Whether it's I think that particular interaction is going to be the best way to do it, and you just then people have just got to beat you over the head to convince you no, there's this other potentially better way of doing it. Now with software, we have a lot of tools in our tool belt, if you will, to help check our bias around our ideas. So doing experimental testing of different versions of an idea, certainly as we put it out into the world, and we do it with tiny percentages of the Facebook community, just to see how are people using this when we put it out into the wild, and not, and just realizing how many assumptions go into that creative process, and having just a lot of safety checks. Because, when you're designing for a base of 1.7 billion people, you really need to be sure that whatever you're putting out to 100% of that community is a really solid solution.
That's never happened before.
No.
Right? You're in new territory in terms of designing the size of your population.
Yeah. We're kind of, at some level inventing it as we go along, the different methods and capabilities of designing for that large of a community, that diverse of a community. Yeah, there's definitely no playbook.
Your particular contributions, things that you've done throughout your career, you've also worked at YouTube and Google. Did you give us the thumbs up, thumbs down at YouTube? Am I correct about that? Not you personally, but you were on that.
Yeah, so it was one of the earlier projects that I worked on. Previously, we had a 5-star rating system for YouTube videos, and most of the videos on YouTube are pretty short form. They're a few seconds, maybe a couple of minutes long, and we looked at the data, and not surprisingly, there were a few people using 1 star, a huge number using 5 stars, and no one using 2, 3, and 4 stars. And so what we realized was we had a significantly overly complicated interface associated with that. But, what was interesting about that realization was, and then we, designed solutions, we tested them, we thought, oh, you know what, this up-down system is actually going to improve engagement and make it much faster for people to give us that feedback, because you just don't want to think that much. You don't want to think along 5 levels when you're talking about, a short video. But introducing that change is really complicated. People get very wedded to the way things work. They get muscle memory around software. They have emotional investment. So you had the video makers who really had invested in this idea of star ratings as something that they were valuing. And so in that case, we actually, before we introduced the new design, we actually published the graph that showed the usage of the stars and said, wow, what do you guys make of this? Our star system doesn't seem to be working that well. And of course, the community, weighed in many ways, saying, yeah, you should totally change this, and blah, blah. So when we introduced it, there was a core of the community that was already supportive. But it was funny because there was a headline at the time when we released it that was one of my favorite headlines of all time. I think it said something akin to, YouTube has a 5-star rating system, or 5-star realization. Its rating system doesn't work. So, it was one of those things where, we knew what we needed to do, but you still had to be very careful about introducing the change.
What portion, that's still there, the thumbs up, thumbs down. What portion of things that you've designed and launched into the world that you had a vested interest in are now obsolete and years in the past and gone and will never be revived. And how does it feel to have your work, made obsolescent so
I mean,
quickly?
it's got to be like 95% of what
Really?
I've done. It's, software is like an organic living
Your whole
thing.
career is a sell-by date?
It's all, I'm totally washed up. It's, sometimes I get jealous of industrial designers because they get to design an object that gets manufactured and then they can like put it in wherever they store their stuff and like look back on it.
Like an old power drill.
Yeah, exactly. For me, I always think of software design as kind of a socially acceptable form of insanity because you're never done. Like the second you push that thing, you're like, oh, now there's all those other things that we decided to put into V2, we have to start working on that. Or now we realize, now that we've released it, that we need to fix X, Y, and Z. And so, yeah, you definitely have to check your ego at the door. Like there's not going to be, a portfolio of like physical things that you can look at. And in fact, the medium changes so fast that things that I created 15, 20 years ago, you have to, use the Wayback Machine, and it's like hard to access, and so even accessing old designs can be really difficult. It's funny because I've been talking to a couple, the Cooper Hewitt Design Museum about how do we archive these things? They're actually pretty important in terms of understanding the role that design has played in society and changing the way that we communicate and connect. But how do I create a version of Facebook or Twitter or YouTube that is as real and relevant to you as it is to me? Because your Facebook is totally different than mine. So it's really interesting kind of question. It's like, how do we preserve these so that future generations will understand what they were?
You've already alluded to the fact that people will have, for example, muscle memory related to a particular software experience. But what that's really saying is that your design is changing human behavior. Is that a responsibility that anybody is really given much thought to and sweats over?
I think it's
in the rush to move forward, or do people ponder it?
I think it's a huge responsibility, and I think that it's something that we have to constantly remind ourselves of, is that because there can be unintended consequences, right? I think that in the companies that I've worked at, we have all kinds of aspirations to do good in the world, but you put tools out there, and you expect that there's going to be certain outcomes, but it does change behavior, and sometimes we can foresee all of what that means, and sometimes we can't. I think the best that we can do, and I think this is true throughout the history of media. This is not unique to these technologies, although it's happening faster and more globally than it has in the past. There's things we can learn from looking at the introduction of print and radio and television, because there are some similarities there and things that we can learn. We just saw that amazing video of like people trying to get on the escalator. It's just like, new stuff is scary. It's, incomprehensible to people, and then eventually they incorporate it into their lives. I think what we need to do is always stay in touch with our community and figure out, is what we are creating lifting them up? Is it making their lives or their work better? And if so, like, how can we amplify that? And if not, how can we change it?
Has software ever blown it in that regard, in a big way?
Oh, I mean, listen, I think, software is created by humans, and therefore it is not perfect, right? I mean, I think the introduction of the healthcare.gov stuff, a website that just was not ready for what it was designed to do. Or, I mean, there's all kinds of examples.
Or any VCR box from 20 years
Well,
ago.
exactly, with the blinking lights at the blinking time. I think we have to have humility about what we do, because that's what's going to keep us from being blind about where we failed and where we can improve.
You've done talks, we've talked about twin pillars. I want to take questions right after this answer, so you can get ready. Humility is one thing you've mentioned, and audacity. How do those two things work together?
Yeah, I think that the role that the designer plays has to be infused with humility, because I think that's when we are most open to opportunities, feedback, and ways to have greater impact. I also think that products like Facebook or YouTube or any of these globally impactful products, there is there is an audacity associated with taking on those challenges and saying, I'm going to try to connect the entire world. Like, that's an audacious thing to set out to do. And so it's really about having that combination of audacity and humility that allows you to take on these big problems, these big societal problems that are hard to fix, but have the humility to do it in a way that's really human-centered and, again, really in service of other people.
Bravo for that. Let's take some questions. Are there any? Right over here.
I'm Chris Deutsch. Actually, I'm ironically Facebook Living.
You're
right
Facebook Living. That's so meta.
It is. And actually, that's sort of
everyone.
the point of the question, too.
Yeah.
I'm really interested in how you're thinking about synchronous and live sharing. Facebook's got a really unique opportunity because they have amazing critical mass across the globe.
Yeah.
So how are you thinking about other ways of enabling real-time synchronous sharing with people, both online like I'm doing now, but also offline, bringing people together outside of Facebook?
Yeah, I think that for me, what's interesting to me is, again, because I think of myself as a student of human nature, there's so many different ways that we want to share. We want to share with people that we know. We want to share with people that we don't know. We want to share in ways that we want to have that be durable and live on forever, and we want to share in ways that are ephemeral. I call them kind of digital Post-it notes, things that I can just send and I know are going to not live on. And I think that the opportunity in particular for video is to play a role across all of those scenarios. The thing that I find really interesting about live and what we see in the product as well is that there's the excitement about seeing something as it's happening, but there's potentially even greater value in seeing something that was captured live, right? So if you think about this in terms of music, going to a concert is incredible and seeing a musician live, but you can also listen to a live recording, and that is amazing too, and actually can impact far greater number of people than the people who can actually physically get into the concert. And so I think it's less about saying, like, there's one way in which, live communication is going to impact, and more, can we facilitate that, but also make it so that we can share those live experiences after the fact and have people in a secondary way kind of experience what it meant to be there, if that makes sense.
Is there a question over here?
My name's Martin O'Shield with Windy City SDR. We're being invited to Facebook's headquarters November 1st and 2nd for the Facebook Telecom Infrastructure Project initial meeting. Do you know anything about?
Actually I don't, which I apologize. I wish I could comment on, but I'm excited that you're coming to visit. I hope you have a great time.
Is there another question? Up here?
Savzai, independent project manager. Question on monetization discussions with design and user experience discussions. What are they like? Because on one hand, the experience came first, right? When Facebook was a startup and monetization came later. So what is the nature of these discussions now that Facebook is a mature company generating revenue?
We always lead with the experience for the community, always. We can't lead with monetization strategy because we have to, businesses want to be where the people are, right? If we prioritize the connection with businesses first and foremost, it may be a great party, but there may be nobody who shows up, right? And so,
but if there's not money at the end of the road, will the project be abandoned?
Not necessarily. I mean, there's investments that we make that are just in the long term because we think that they're good for the community, good for society. And so, obviously we want and need to be a sustainable, profitable business. And so we think pretty carefully about our investments across the board. But, we definitely, I think the key for us is we're always trying to take the long view of things, which is hard to do in the type of technology that we work in the way that investors think about things, but we're always thinking about how can we build long-term value for people, long-term value for businesses. That dramatically changes your point of view on what you're going to do in the short term. And so it is very, very rare. Like, for instance, when we talk about revenue within the company, we talk about it as a trailing indicator of value, not a leading indicator of value. it's very easy to measure, which makes it kind of intoxicating to use, but we try to be really careful to find other measures of success, even for businesses, to be able to understand how are we building value in the long run.
It sounds like you're having fun.
It is fun. It is.
Thank you so much. Thank you for your questions.
Thank you. This one?